Yeah, okay, that was a bit awkward, but it kind of reminded me of that awkward silence we've all been through while talking with someone we barely know and have nothing left to say. But what is silence? Well, we could say that this is silence. We usually think of silence as the absence of sound, so what if I told you that silence isn't silent? That silence can actually speak louder than words, and not just in a metaphorical sense. It shapes our lives, our politics, our emotions. Silence can oppress or liberate, alienate, or connect. Let's start with a silence that isn't imposed but creeps in quietly. This type of silence starts at school when a kid is bullied but no one speaks up, and continues to grow as we grow older. This silence becomes more dangerous, more ingrained in our society. On the subway when someone is harassed but no one says anything. And even on a global scale when we remain silent about climate change or wars. This is the kind of silence that destroys not just homes but hopes. The silence that says to the oppressed, you don't matter. Most people believe that this type of silence is neutral, but as Desmond Tutu once said, I quote, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Which brings us to an uncomfortable but vital philosophical truth. Neutrality, silence, and action in these cases becomes a choice. And because this choice always favors the oppressor over the oppressed, this choice becomes a form of complicity. Silence as complicity is the silence of fear, discomfort, or indifference that sustains violence in our everyday lives and creates a world where oppressors profit from silence. We've seen proof of this with movements like #MeToo, and a case in France, the Affaire Mazan, is a shocking example of this. Gisèle Pellicot was drugged and raped by dozens of men over the course of years, and she never knew. Her own husband, Dominique Pellicot, set up everything. He posted ads on Coco named "Without Her Consent," inviting men to their home to assault her, all while she was unconscious. The most disturbing part in this case is that some of these men involved claim that they thought that she was pretending to be unconscious as part of a role play, as if silence could ever be mistaken for consent. One of the defense lawyers went as far as to say, if we can prove that the person knew that they were committing rape, then it's rape, otherwise it's not. This is where the case highlights a much bigger issue, how French law and society sees consent and rape culture. And because French law is less clear on the notion of consent compared to Spain, where they recently passed a law famously known as "only yes means yes." This is why the defense is trying to twist the idea of presumption of innocence, claiming that their clients didn't realize that she wasn't consenting, as if the absence of a clear no could justify what happened. None of these men seeing an unconscious woman thought to stop or call the police. They stayed silent, and their silence enabled the abuse to go on for so long. Silence is what keeps societal issues like rape culture alive. Whether it's at school, on the subway, in the courtroom, or on the global stage, silence can destroy. By maintaining the status quo, by covering up wrongdoings and letting injustice thrive. Because this type of silence always maintains systems of oppression. And while silence as a tool of control in systems of oppression is nothing new, history is full of examples of tyrants and authoritarian regimes using silence not just as an absence but as a weapon. And while I can't talk about authoritarian regimes without mentioning 1984 by George Orwell, it's a classic example of how language is used to control thought. In his dystopian worlds, the government didn't just shrink the vocabulary with newspeak. They made it impossible for people to even think about rebellion. They didn't just silence opposition, they erased the ability to express it. Now, of course, we could talk about places like China or North Korea, where freedom of speech is very questionable. But even in democracies, free speech in the digital age isn't as simple. You know, those mysterious little programs that decide what pops up on your feed. While they're not exactly censoring us, they do shape what we see and hear. And that raises a serious ethical dilemma. Because while we technically have the freedom to say whatever we want, what actually reaches us can still be controlled in subtle ways we don't always notice. Whether we're talking about Orwell's dystopia or our own digital age, silence as a tool of control is powerful because it shapes how we understand and interact with the world. And sometimes the most dangerous kind of silence isn't just what is being silenced, it's what we don't even know we're missing. But while silence can be used as a form of control, it can also serve as a powerful tool for reclaiming our autonomy in a world full of distraction. In a world designed to keep us constantly consuming and interacting, Unplugging can feel surprisingly radical. Think about it. These algorithms are crafted because corporations profit from the time we spend on their platforms. This means our attention is increasingly manipulated for profit. Advertisers, content creators, and platforms are all fighting for your attention. And yeah, it's a bit ironic that I'm talking about this while you're watching my video, which was likely suggested to you thanks to the algorithm. And while I do my best to create content that's knowledgeable, I also put effort into making thumbnails and titles for you to click and try to be entertaining for you to stay and watch. And just so you know, 50% of viewers click off my videos after 40 seconds. So I guess I'm still working on my entertaining skills. But back to the point. We're so used to constant stimulation that the idea of sitting alone in silence can feel almost terrifying. It's like, wait, I have to sit alone with my own thoughts? No way. In a world where we're constantly connected, we often confuse being alone with loneliness. Just as we confuse being alone with being alone in silence, which means not scrolling on our phones. Silence can help peel away layers of social conditioning and expectations that hide our true selves. Alan Watts referred this as breaking free from the ego. The ego could be described as the role we play rather than who we truly are. Your ego is a bit like a social media profile. It's the you show to others, but is also influenced by what others think of you. It's not just a role you play, it's a version of yourself that you might start believing is the real you. The ego can trick you into lying to yourself, but also keep you from enjoying the present moment. For example, while you're watching my video, if you keep thinking, I'm watching this video, you're focusing on your role as the audience. You're aware of your phone, maybe the bed you're lying on, and me talking on the screen. This focus on your role creates a separation between you and the experience. It's like a barrier that keeps you from fully engaging with what's happening right now. But imagine if you forget about being the audience and get lost in the video. You're not thinking about your role or your surroundings, you're just enjoying the content. This is a lot like what happens when you let go of the ego. When you stop focusing on your role or your identity, you become able to stop focusing on what others think and just engage in the moment. Dropping the ego allows you to connect with your true self and the world around you, without the distraction of self-consciousness. Alan Watts' perspective on the ego was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Taoism, where silence plays an important part in their daily practices. When we sit in silence, we have the chance to think about who we really are. It allows us to think deeply, to hear our own thoughts, and make sense of the world on our own terms, reclaiming our attention and autonomy in a noisy, chaotic world. But as with most things in life, silence isn't just black or white, and often sits in that uncomfortable gray area between liberation and oppression. Silence can mean very different things depending on the context. And while chosen silence isn't always this peaceful retreat, because in the context of mental health, silence can sometimes be harmful. If you've ever experienced depression or known someone that has, you know that the silence that goes with it isn't peaceful. Here, silence doesn't offer relief. It deepens the sense of isolation. It disconnects you from the world, from others, and even yourself, making it nearly impossible to reach out. This is why silence doesn't always heal and can sometimes be harmful. So if you ever feel isolated, please don't forget to reach out to a friend or a specialist. Please remember that it's okay to ask for help and that sometimes it's necessary. And so just as chosen silence can be harmful, well, imposed silence can also be healing. For example, when a parent or a teacher watches you struggle through a difficult task, like solving a math problem, well, in this case, they're not just abandoning you to that annoying calculator, but they're actually giving you the space to think, to grow, and figure things out on your own. This type of silence actually says, I know you can do this. And of course, this doesn't just apply to math problems, but actually with real-life problems. It's just that I have a personal issue with maths. But for an even more concrete example, we would sometimes talk for hours with my dad about the answers on life that I didn't yet have. Most of the time, he would give me great advice, but sometimes he would only give me hints, and other times he wouldn't even say anything. When I was younger, I didn't really understand because I wanted to know all the answers. And sometimes I would tell myself, if you know, why don't you just tell me? But sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is to stay quiet and let someone find their way. It's kind of like when you're passing a test and someone asks if they can copy you. Of course, you could let them cheat, but even if you seem to be helping them, are you really helping them long term by giving them all of the answers? This is why imposed silence, when done by someone who cares, isn't always harmful. And finally, just as breaking silence can change the world, as we saw with movements like #MeToo, sometimes forcing someone to break their silence can be more harmful than good. For example, a survivor of sexual assault might not be ready to share their story. Pressuring them to speak up could re-traumatize them and make their healing process even more painful. Similarly, in the LGBTQ+ community, outing someone without their consent can be very harmful, exposing them to risks they weren't prepared for, whether emotional, social, or even physical. In these situations, silence isn't about oppression, it's a shield, because silence can sometimes protect someone until they're ready to speak their truth. In the end, whether it's a tool of oppression or liberation, silence shapes our lives in ways we often overlook. Silence speaks louder than words because it's filled with intention. And I believe that the sound of silence might be the loudest thing we will ever hear, and that just as words, it needs to be chosen wisely.